South of the Border, West of the Sun by Haruki Murakami. Chapter 6. During this period, one more woman with a lame leg figured in a strange incident, whose meaning, even now, I can't totally understand. I was 28 when it happened. I was in Shibuya, walking along in the end-of-year crowds, when I spotted a woman dragging her leg exactly as Shimamoto used to do. She had on a long red overcoat, and a black patent leather handbag was tucked under one arm. On her left wrist she wore a silver watch, which was more like a bracelet, really. Everything about her said money. I was on the opposite side of the street, but when I saw her, I rushed over at the intersection. The streets were so crowded it made me wonder where all these people could possibly have come from, but it didn't take long to catch up with her. With a bad leg, she walked fairly slowly, just like Shimamoto, rotating her left leg as she dragged it along. I couldn't take my eyes off the elegant curve inscribed by her beautiful stockinged legs, the kind of elegance only long years of practice could produce. I tailed her for a long while, staying a little way behind her. It wasn't easy keeping pace with her, walking at a speed the opposite of the crowd around. I adjusted my pace, stopping sometimes to look into a shop window or pretending to rummage around in my pockets. She had on black leather gloves and carried a red department store carrier bag. Despite the overcast winter day, she wore a pair of sunglasses. From behind, all I could make out was her beautiful, neatly combed hair, curled fashionably outwards at shoulder length, and her back tucked away in that soft, warm-looking red coat. Of course, if I really wanted to see if she was Shimamoto, I could have circled around in front and taken a good look at her. But what if it was Shimamoto? What should I say to her, and how should I act? She might not even remember me. For one thing, I needed time to pull myself together. I took some deep breaths to clear my head. Taking care not to overtake her, I followed her for a long time. She never once looked back or stopped. She seemed to have a place to get to, and was determined to get there as soon as possible. Like Shimamoto, she walked with her back erect and her head held high. Looking at her from the waist up, no one would ever have suspected that she had something wrong with her leg. She just walked more slowly than most people. The longer I looked at her, the more I remembered Shimamoto. If this wasn't Shimamoto, it had to be her twin. The woman cut through the crowds in front of Shibuya Station and started up the slope in the direction of Aoyama. The hill slowed her down more. Still, she covered quite a bit of ground, so much I wondered why she didn't take a taxi. Even for someone with good legs, it was a long way. Yet, on she walked, dragging her leg, with me following at a discreet distance. Nothing in any of the windows caught her eye. She switched her handbag and her shopping bag from right to left a few times, but other than that, she went on walking, never varying her pace. Finally, she left the crowded main street. She seemed to know the layout of the area well. One step away from the bustling shopping area, you entered a quiet residential street. I followed, taking even greater care not to be spotted in the thinned-out crowd. I must have followed her for 40 minutes. We went down the back street, turned several corners and once again emerged into the main thoroughfare, but she didn't join the flow of passer-by. Instead, as if she'd planned it all along, she went straight into a cafe, which also sold cakes and sweets. I killed 10 minutes or so, sauntering back and forth, then went in after her. It was stiflingly warm inside, yet she sat with her back to the door, still in her heavy overcoat. Her red overcoat couldn't be missed. I sat down at the table furthest from the entrance and ordered a cup of coffee. I picked up a newspaper lying on the table and, pretending to read, watched what she was doing. A cup of coffee sat on her table, but in all the time I watched her, she didn't touch it. Once she took a cigarette out of her handbag and lit it with a gold lighter, but other than that, she just sat there, without moving, staring out the window. She could have been taking a rest, or maybe she was deep in thought about some weighty matter. Sipping my coffee, I read the same article a dozen times. After a long time, she stood up abruptly and headed right towards me. It happened so suddenly, I felt as if my heart had stopped. But she wasn't coming over to me. She passed my table and went to the phone. Dropping in some coins, she dialed a number. The phone wasn't far from where I was sitting, but with all the loud conversations and Christmas carols booming out the speakers, I couldn't hear what she was saying. She talked for a long time. Her coffee, untouched, grew cold, and when she passed me, I could see her face from the front, but still I couldn't be absolutely sure if she was Shimamoto. She had on thick makeup, and half her face was hidden by those sunglasses. Her eyebrows were distinctly penciled on, and her bright outlined thin lips were drawn tightly together. Her face reminded me of Shimamoto as a young girl, but if someone had told me it wasn't her, I would have believed them. After all, the last time I'd seen Shimamoto, we were both 12, and more than 15 years had passed. All I could say for sure was that this was an attractive young woman in her 20s, who had an expensive outfit, and she had a bad leg. Sweat rolled down me. My t-shirt was soaked. I took off my coat and ordered another cup of coffee. Just what do you think you're doing? I asked myself. I'd lost a pair of gloves and gone out to Shibuya to buy a replacement, but as soon as I caught sight of this woman, I was following her like someone possessed. Most people would have gone straight up to her and said, "Excuse me, aren't you Miss Shimamoto?" But I didn't. I said nothing and followed her, and I had finally come to the point where there was no turning back. Finishing with her call, the woman went back to her seat. Just as before, she sat with her back to me, gazing at the scene outside. The waitress came up and asked if she could take her cold coffee away. I couldn't hear, but I think that's what she must have said. The woman turned round and nodded, and, it appeared, ordered another cup of coffee. When it came, though, again, she didn't touch it. I continued to glance at the paper. Again and again, she brought her wrist up to check the time on her silver watch, as if she were waiting for someone impatiently. This might be my last chance, I told myself. If that other person shows up, I'll never be able to talk to her. But I remained rooted to my chair. It's still okay, I explained to myself. It's still okay, there's no need to rush. Nothing happened for 15 to 20 minutes. She kept on gazing at the street scene outside. Suddenly, without warning, she stood up quietly, tucked her handbag under her arm, and picked up the carrier bags in one hand. She'd given up waiting, apparently. Or maybe she hadn't been waiting for anyone after all. I watched her as she paid her bill and left the cafe. Then I stood quickly and paid my own bill and went after her. I could see her red overcoat making its way through the crowds. I followed her, weaving my way through the throng. She had her hand up, trying to call a taxi. Finally, one switched off its light and pulled over to the curb. I have to call her out, I thought. If she gets in the taxi, it's all over. Just as I stepped forward, though, someone grabbed my elbow. The powerful grip took my breath away. It didn't hurt, but the strength of the grip made me choke. I turned around to find myself face to face with a middle-aged man staring straight at me. The man was a couple of inches shorter than me, but powerfully built. In his mid-40s, I guessed. He had on a dark grey overcoat and a cashmere scarf, both of which looked very expensive. His hair was neatly parted, and he wore a pair of design tortoise-shell glasses. Seemingly into sport, he was nicely tanned. Skiing, I wondered. Or maybe tennis. I wondered how Izumi's father, who loved tennis, had the same sort of tan. This man looked like the executive of a prosperous firm, or maybe more like an important civil servant. His eyes told you that. The eyes of a man who is used to giving orders. "Would you care for some coffee?" he asked quietly. I followed the woman with my eyes. Bending down to get into the taxi, she glanced through her sunglasses in our direction. At least it seemed to me she looked our way. The taxi door closed and she disappeared from view, leaving me and this middle-aged stranger behind. "I won't take much of your time," the man said, his tone of voice placid. He was neither angry nor excited. As though holding open a door for someone, he continued to grasp my arm tightly. "Let's have some coffee and talk." I could have walked away. "I don't want any coffee, and I have nothing to talk to you about. First of all, I don't know who you are, and I'm in a hurry, so if you'll excuse me," I could have said. But I clammed up and just stared. Finally, I nodded and did as he said, following him back into the cafe. Perhaps I was afraid of something in that powerful grip. I could feel a strangely immovable force there. More machine-like than human, his grip on me was perfect, never wavering in its pressure. If I had refused his suggestion, what would he have done to me? I couldn't imagine. But as well as being scared, I was also half curious. I wanted to find out what he could possibly want to talk to me about. Maybe it would lead to some information about the woman. Now that she'd disappeared, this man might be the only link connecting her to me. Besides, the man wasn't about to beat me up in a cafe, was he? We sat down at a table, facing each other. Until the waitress came, we didn't say a word. We sat there, staring. The man ordered 2 coffees. "Why, may I ask you, were you following her for so long?" he asked me politely. I couldn't answer. With expressionless eyes, he looked long and hard at me. "I know you were following her all the way from Shibuya," he said. "Follow someone that far, and they're bound to catch on." I didn't reply. She had realized I was following her, had gone into the cafe and called this man. "If you don't want to say anything, that's okay. I know what's going on without you having to tell me." He may have been worked up, but you couldn't tell from the polite, quiet way he spoke. "There are several options here," the man said. "I'm not joking. Whatever I feel like doing, believe me, I can do." Then he fell silent and continued to look at me, as if to give me the message that he didn't need an explanation since he had the situation under control. As before, I said nothing. "But if you don't want things to go out of hand, I don't want to cause a scene, understand me? This time only," he said. He raised his right hand, which was lying on the table, reached into his inside pocket and took out a white envelope. All the while his left hand remained on the table. It was nothing special, just a plain white business envelope. "Take this, and don't say a word. I know someone put you up to this, and I'd like to settle the matter amicably. Not a word about what's happened. Nothing special happened to you today, and you never met me. Understand? If I ever find out you've said anything, you can rest assured I will find you and take care of the matter. So I'd like you to forget about following her. Neither of us wants any trouble, correct?" The man put the envelope in front of me and stood up. Snatching up the bill, he paid the cashier and strode out of the cafe. I sat there, dumbfounded. Finally, I picked up the envelope on the table and looked inside. There were 10,000 yen notes. Crisp, new 10,000 yen notes. My mouth was parched. I shoved the envelope in my pocket and left the shop. I looked around, making sure that the man wasn't there, then hailed a taxi and went back to Shibuya, where this misadventure began. Years later, I still had that envelope with the money. Without ever opening it again, I stuck it in a drawer in my desk. On nights when I couldn't fall asleep, I could see his face, like an unlucky premonition of something. His face floated clearly into my mind. Who the hell was he, anyway? And was that woman Shimamoto? I came up with several theories. It was a puzzle without a solution. I would think of a hypothesis, only to shoot it down. The most convincing explanation was that this man was the woman's lover, who thought I was a detective hired by her husband to report on her activities, and the man thought his money would buy my silence. Maybe they thought I'd seen them both leaving a hotel where they had a rendezvous. It made sense, but even so, my gut feeling said no. Too many questions remained. He said that if he wanted to, there were several things he could do to me, but what things did he mean? Why was he able to grab me in that unexpected way? If the woman knew I was following her, why didn't she hail a taxi? She could have lost me in a minute. And why did that man, not knowing who I really was, toss me an envelope full of so much money? It continued to be a riddle. Sometimes I think it must have all been a delusion, from start to finish, a fantasy I'd cooked up in my head. Or maybe a very long, realistic dream that somehow I'd mixed up with reality. But it did happen. Inside the drawer of my desk, there was a white envelope with 10,000 yen notes inside. Proof that it wasn't a dream. It really happened. Sometimes I put the envelope on top of my desk and stare at it. It really did happen. End of chapter 6.